Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo De Vos, and without further ado, let's talk about food. Hey everybody, welcome back to the For Food's Sake podcast. In today's episode, we talk about soil. And we welcome back David Montgomery on the podcast, who has been on the podcast before to talk about soil. But in this episode, more specifically, we're going to be talking about how profoundly soil fertility and soil erosion has shaped the course of history. Now, this is a discussion that will make you think twice about the stuff beneath your feet that we commonly call dirt. And it may even make you realize that soil is actually one of the most precious natural resources we have. And in this conversation, we look back at how soil has shaped ancient civilizations, from the ancient Greeks and Romans to the Mayans and the Incans, and specifically how the mistreatment of soils has led to the collapse of civilizations. And in our discussion, Dave lays out a convincing argument for why the plow, which really is the central instrument of farming both today and historically, may actually have been more destructive than the sword. Now, Dave is a professor of Earth and Space Sciences at the University of Washington in the United States, and he's a MacArthur Fellow. He's also the author of King of Fish, Dirt, The Erosion of Civilisations, The Hidden Half of Nature, which he co-authored with his wife, Anne Biklé, and he also wrote Growing a Revolution, which is his latest book. Our conversation today focuses mainly on the importance of soil by discussing its social and cultural history. And whilst we will delve into some of the solutions, if you want a more in-depth discussion on solutions, I'd recommend you check out episode 24 of the For Food's Sake podcast, which I did with Dave in December last year, which is called The Soilution, Saving Our Soil, Saving Ourselves. All right, well, that's definitely enough from me. Let's get straight into it. Here is David Montgomery. We have David Montgomery on the podcast. Dave, welcome back on the podcast.
Hey, thank you, Matteo. It's a pleasure to be here.
So today I'd like to talk about the significance and the importance of soil, which I know is something you know a lot about, by looking specifically at how soil erosion has helped shape the course of civilizations, how it's encouraged empire and colonialism and slavery, and also how it's influencing our current global economy and also the industrial agriculture model on which we currently rely, how that encourages soil erosion. For those that maybe haven't read your work or haven't listened to the previous podcast episode we did together where we talked a lot about what soil was as well, let's start with a little crash course on what soil is and what soil formation is and erosion and all those terms. So could you maybe start by defining what for you is soil, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. We can do the sort of the little crash course on that. It's you can kind of think of soil as the marriage of geology and biology. It's what you get when you mix rocks that are broken up, so they're not solid rock anymore. You break them down and mix it with organic matter and living matter, sort of the biology part. And the formal definition of soil would be something like weathered rocks at the surface of the earth that are capable of supporting a rooted plant life. But the informal definition I like to use is the marriage of geology and biology, the frontier between the dead world of the interior of our planet and the living crust of the planet that we are a part of and that our food is a part of. And soil is literally the frontier between those two worlds and the foundation for the fertility that grows the food that we rely on. So we know of one planet in the universe so far that has soil, and that's the one that we live on. And there's no coincidence that that's also the one planet that we know of that has life on it, because soil and life are intimately related. And, our knowledge of that as humanity goes back a long ways because we've made our living from agriculture now for the most part for, 10,000 some odd years. But the idea that we're related to the surface of the earth and how it works. It's sort of filtered through how soil is formed, how it breaks down. So soil formation is how you break down rocks and merge it with the biology. Soil erosion is how soils are physically removed from one location where they formed and translocated to another place where they become, say, sediment in a reservoir or mud in the sea or sediment at an estuary where the rivers meet the ocean. And you can think of dirt as soil that's out of place.
Okay. When you talk about, so you mentioned you've got formation and you've got erosion. I think people, especially when it comes to soil erosion, we usually hear it in a context as something that, it's a problem, especially in terms of agriculture. But could you talk a little bit more about, I guess, maybe also the difference between soil erosion and soil degradation, and why all soil erosion isn't necessarily bad?
Yeah, that's a really good point. If you think about soil as a system, kind of like, say, each one of our bank accounts, we all have an income, usually not as much as we'd like, but something, and we all have expenses, usually more than we'd like, but and it's that balance between income and expenses, the difference between the two, controls what happens to your savings as you go on living. So if you're making more money than you're spending, you're building your savings up. And if you're spending more than you're making, you're burning your savings down. You can think of soil the same way because it's a system that's produced by the breakdown of rocks and the merging with organic matter to build new soils. And the removal of soil off the landscape is erosion. So there's a loss from a place. And you can think of the thickness of the soil, whether it's 3 inches thick, 6 inches thick, or 2 feet thick. That's the savings, if you will, from that difference between soil production and soil erosion. So if we're doing things to the land that cause the soil to be eroded or removed faster than it's being replaced, we're losing that, we're losing some thickness of that soil. We're actually decreasing the supply of soil available at that place on the land. Whereas if we're doing things that build the soil faster than it's eroding, we're building up the stock of soil. So you can think of soil, in effect, as natural capital. It's the savings that allows life to reinvest in itself and grow more life, whether in a forest, a grassland, or on a farm. And so if you have soil loss that proceeds faster than soil formation for long enough that you burn through the physical supply of soil, you can literally erode the soil right off the landscape. And we can talk more about certain societies that have done this in the past. But this is a problem that I looked into in writing that Dirt, the Erosion of Civilisations book. It's a fairly common problem in the past of humanity, but it plays out kind of slowly because the average rate of soil erosion is millimeter a year kind of rates. We tend to look at the land as something that is stable, that it's not changing, that's always the way it was yesterday. Because over the course of our lives, if something is being removed at a millimeter a year or so, it takes 25 years to take an inch of soil off the land at that pace. And if that's maintained over generations or centuries, you can literally strip the soil off the landscape. And so that's the ultimate downside of soil erosion. Soil degradation is a different thing. It's not necessarily losing the soil itself, but it's degrading its ability to grow plants, to grow food in an agricultural setting. And if you look at sort of soil quality and soil fertility, there's really sort of 3 components to it. There's the chemical makeup of the soil itself. What kind of rocks was it made out of? There's how much organic matter is in it, and that you can think of that organic matter as food for the life in the soil that makes its living by breaking down dead things, by recycling dead plants and dead animals, and breaking them down. And fungi and bacteria do this. Organisms we don't tend to think a whole lot about, and we usually think about them as pests and pathogens, things that could give us or plants diseases. But there's this critical role that they play in the soil of taking once living organisms and recycling them into elements that new generations of plants can take up so people like us can eat them, or our livestock can eat them so we can then eat the livestock. And the reason that's important is that if you look at the composition, the bulk chemical composition of the earth, and so, what are rocks made out of? It's really different than what you and I are made out of, or what a plant is made out of. There's a process of refining the bulk elements that are in the world into the things that make up living organisms that is all mediated through what happens in the soil. So, plants get carbon and and hydrogen and oxygen from photosynthesis to build the carbohydrate backbones of their bodies. They tend to get nitrogen out of the atmosphere with the partnerships of microbes that live in and around their roots. So it's some of the oldest symbioses that we know about. But there's a lot more that goes into a plant. They need like copper and selenium and iron and zinc, and those elements, which are derived from minerals, from rocks, are really important to our health, because in great part because that's how those carbohydrate backbones that plants can make with photosynthesis get twisted into enzymes that actually do stuff that are important biologically. So we need those mineral elements. We don't need a lot of them. Like, you don't need a lot of copper. If you eat too much copper, you're going to be sick. It'll be toxic. But you need some to actually structure enzymes that are really important in the running of our bodies. So you need that biological matter of once living things, the organic matter, to get recycled, to keep that copper and that selenium and that zinc and that iron in play in the biological world. Because if you've ever taken a rock, and geologists, don't often do this, but you can run the thought experiment. Take a rock, go sit it out on the sidewalk somewhere and leave it there. How long will you have to wait before it breaks down into soil?
Oh, God.
It happens really slowly, man, really slowly. So you think of all those micronutrients, those elements that are naturally locked up in the rocks. The way they got into living organisms was through cycles of life and death and refining and keeping that material in play through generations of living organisms. And soil is the reactor that drives that system, and the life in the soil, the biology, the bacteria and the fungi, which was the subject of that Hidden Half of Nature book that my wife, Anne Biklé, and I wrote. That's the stuff that really sort of keeps soil fertile and in play. So soil degradation, back to your original question, is that long-term degradation of soil life and the physical structure of the soil, the things that make it able to support the growth, the healthy growth of plants, the things that sort of define fertility. So the two big problems with soil are soil loss itself, soil erosion, and soil degradation, which translates kind of roughly into loss of soil organic matter and loss of soil structure, the open spaces that life can live in within the soil. And you mentioned one other thing in your initial question, and that was how soil erosion can be a good thing sometimes. So with all that I've just gone through, how could that be possible? Well, if you think about, again, the thought experiment of a landscape, say, in the tropics, where it's really hot and it's really wet, but it's really flat, so there's not much erosion, because on steeper slopes you'll get more erosion. If it's really flat, you won't get much erosion. And so you have this flat surface made out of, some random rock, and you rain on it in a hot environment, and that water percolates down through that rock, and it keeps stripping out elements and taking it to the groundwater, so that ultimately you don't have much left in that rock to nourish a plant. Well, that's one of the reasons why a little bit of soil erosion is actually a good thing, because by eroding stuff off the surface, you're essentially bringing rocks into play, so they'll be broken down by when a tree falls over and its roots rip it up, or when a gopher burrows into it and breaks a piece off and takes it to the surface. You need that refreshing of the material in the soil. So a little bit of soil erosion is actually important for getting those elements out of Earth's structure and into biological play. But if you erode it too fast, you can basically strip it off faster than nature uses it. So you kind of want a balance. And if you look around the world, as I did in writing that dirt book, and look at the scientifically measured rates of soil production and soil loss, sort of how fast soils are made naturally, how fast they erode under native ecosystems, native vegetation, grasslands and forests, they're roughly in balance. And that balance is maintained at a pace of, fractions of a millimeter a year. Like the average erosion rate on Earth without human influences is about 0.02 millimeters a year, 2% of a millimeter a year. That's really slow, man. It's hard to measure that. You look at the average rate of soil erosion on plowed agricultural fields around the world today, it's about 1.5 millimeters. So it's 100 times faster based on virtually. Year to year, that's not a terribly big problem, but century to century, it adds up to major problems.
Yeah, and I think that brings us on perfectly to one of the core arguments in your book, which is that once you have this imbalance between soil formation and soil erosion, which is very much influenced, but what humans are doing, especially different civilizations, when you look at a civilizational scale, that's where you start to see soil erosion very much influencing the demise of civilizations. And I think one of the most interesting points you make in your book is that you challenge this myth that we have that ancient peoples and ancient civilizations, lived in harmony with nature, right? Lived in harmony with the environment. So could you pick out some examples? I mean, there's plenty in your book of certain civilizations that have historically proven that to the contrary, that our forefathers have eroded soil and lived not in balance with nature.
Yeah, my favorite one of that is essentially the classical Greeks, because we have this enshrined view of a golden age of Greece, which in terms of the origin of politics and democracies, I mean, as far as I can tell, yeah, that's well earned. But if you think about it in terms of the sort of agrarian ideal of a people in tune with nature, there's a really glaring flaw with applying that to classical Greece. And that flaw was first noticed by the classical philosopher Plato. He's the first person that I can tell from my research that has looked at the problem of soil erosion and recognized that if you degrade the landscape through loss of the soil, you're not going to be able to support as many people on that land. And he wrote explicitly about that in one of his dialogues. That unfortunately is one of the dialogues that also addressed the myth of Atlantis, and so it's not been viewed as the most scientifically credible. But if you actually go and read it, what he's basically doing is he's looking at the state of the Greek landscape in the 3rd century, I think it was BC, and he's noticing things like olive trees that are perched on soil pedestals around plowed fields, because the tree was where a farmer would eat their lunch and it had shade. And so you wouldn't plow, you didn't knock your tree down, didn't plow it over. It was a nice amenity to the landscape. And over the centuries, the fields had lowered around that tree, leaving it standing on an island of soil. And Plato recognized that that was not normal. That was something really kind of weird and needed to be explained. And so he wrote about the soil bleeding off the landscape of classical Greece as a result of tillage, of plowing. And as evidence for his hypothesis that it was land use, in effect, that was driving the loss of the soil, he went to the mouths of 2 rivers. One was, I think, the Meander, which is for the name of where meandering rivers comes from, and I forget the name of the other one. But basically, one had its drainage basin, its watershed, was in a forest, and the other was off of farmed fields. And the one that's was flowing out of the forest flowed clear and didn't have a huge delta. The one coming off the farms was flowing muddy, and there was a giant pile of sand and silt and mud at the mouth of the river where the river met the Mediterranean. And he connected the dots and basically said, oh, the soil's eroding off the farms. Now, he didn't really he just sort of noticed it as kind of an oblique section of a dialogue that's mostly focused on other things. But he clearly recognized the connection between how the way people treat their land affects the way the land can sustain the fertility that in turn supports the people. And and the Romans did a similar thing to central Italy. I don't know if you've ever been to or if any of your listeners have been to the ancient port of Rome, Ostia. It's you don't build a port inland, but if you go there today, that ancient port is miles inland.
Right.
And what happened is the soils of central Italy were intensively plowed. I mean, the villain in the dirt book is essentially the plow, because and we could talk about how it is that affects soil erosion. But the plowed hills of central Italy, they were not flat, they were steep. And so the soil ran off, it created the Pontine marshes, and it built out sediment into the Mediterranean, leaving the ancient port sort of abandoned high and dry inland. And there's evidence like that all around the Mediterranean. There's in the south of France, there's similar kind of things. And I go into all that in the dirt book, but the basic pattern that one sees, and the argument that I was making, is not so much that soil erosion destroyed ancient civilizations, but that it undermined their stability. So that you can think of the way I tried to cast human history in that book is that if you have the relationship between the land and people, of one of where you have a lot of fertile land and very few people, you can farm that intensively with tools like the plow that we can go into the why on in a bit. But it's fairly resilient, and you can support a growing population as that land is healthy and fertile and abundance can be had from farming. But when your population gets high enough and your land gets degraded enough that it becomes difficult to support that population, then you become vulnerable to things like droughts, to things like war with the neighboring civilization or society, the kind of things that can happen. So the argument I was making was that soil erosion, or the state of the land, really captured the resiliency of civilizations. And so if you think of history as a time series, you can think of the state of the land, the state of the soil as the broad wavelength of the ups and downs, whereas the things that actually may end a civilization could be the high frequency events that are punctuating that record. Things like a really bad series of droughts, like 3 or 4 in a row. And we know that there's periods, say, in Egyptian history where a big drought brought down a dynasty. Or wars like, the soil erosion didn't sack Rome, but it made it vulnerable to sacking by the Visigoths. So there's those kind of relationships where looking at the, if you will, the sort of the environmental, the environmental conditions on which our history has played out, that there's an order to it in terms of the way that we treated the land. And the short summary of that book that I like to offer is that, societies that don't take care of their land don't stick around.
Right, yeah, and you keep mentioning the plow, of course, as kind of the central element to this. Let's talk a little bit about the plow, and which, of course, makes it still so relevant today, because it's not like the plow is something that no one's ever heard of. So, what's the role of the plow here with soil erosion? And
well, you look at I sort of, as I said, I cast the plow as the villain in the dirt book, and I didn't intend to do that when I started writing the book. That's the story that emerged from the research that I did. And if you look at the sort of how we think about agriculture, the plow is one of those iconic symbols. I mean, that's what you would picture a farmer doing if you were to draw a farmer.
Right.
And it's on this. There's a plow on the seal of the United States Department of Agriculture. It's one designed by Thomas Jefferson, and it's still right there. And yet, if we look at the damage that the plow has done to landscapes around the world through millennia, one can credibly argue that the plow has caused more problems for more civilizations than wars. And that may sound like an outrageous statement, and it kind of is, but there's a germ of truth to it. When you look at so how does that work? Well, back to that soil as a system analogy. How many grasslands or natural forests of the world have you ever walked around in where you see a whole lot of bare earth? No, what you see is a ground surface covered with plants, covered with leaves, covered with twigs and sticks. Nature clothes herself in plants and dead plants, in the organic matter, both living and once living. And there's a reason for that. Organic matter, as it's incorporated into the soil, makes the soil more fertile, and it helps it grow more plants. There's a positive feedback there. What does a plow do? A plow undoes all that in a single stroke. And so it leaves the ground surface bare and vulnerable to erosion by wind or rain. And so if you look back in environmental history textbooks, you find a lot of people arguing that deforestation led to soil erosion that helped undermine civilizations. And it's my contention that it wasn't so much the axe, but it was the plow that followed that allowed the soil erosion that actually connected those dots. Because if you have a forest canopy covering a landscape and you have an understory of vegetation and you've got leaves and twigs and stuff to absorb the moisture, you're not going to have anywhere near as much erosion as if you cut the trees down, you turn up the soil, and you just leave bare earth, sand and silt and clay, exposed at the surface where raindrops can hammer into it, where runoff can sweep it away. And that can happen, 100 times faster than nature's rebuilding the soil. So the plow sort of filled that role in civilization after civilization. So it's essentially a big part of the story of humanity for the last 10,000 years has been inadvertently degrading the land with the very practices we rely on to grow our food. The most recent book, Growing a Revolution, looks at how we could reverse that. And it turns out that the first step of that process is ditching the plow, not disturbing the land surface. Because if you're doing something that causes the soil to erode faster than it's reforming, you are, by definition, losing it. And that can only go on for so long before it actually adds up to real effects on agricultural productivity and your ability to support people across the landscape. And fortunately, it turns out to be not that hard intellectually to characterize what it would take to rebuild fertile soil and sort of cut off that destructive process. And that first step is not plowing. The second and third steps are actually practices that many ancient societies adopted. It would be cover crops, keeping the ground covered, and adopting crop rotations that have at least 3, 4, or more different crops. So you're not just growing the same thing in the same land over and over. You put those three things together, ditching the plow, covering up, and growing a diversity of plants. And it's a recipe for feeding the life in the soil that takes the organic matter at the surface and turns it and repurposes it into essentially plant defense and fertilizer, things that help promote the growth of healthy plants. How you do that agronomically as a farmer, that can be challenging. And so why was the plow so relied on for centuries around the world? It's great weed control. Right. I can't think of a better way to, as a farmer with a lack of the kind of technology that we have available today, how are you going to suppress weeds across a whole farm? Well, if you plow it up and get your seeds in the ground first, so they're the first things that come up, it works. It works really well. But the price you pay is the progressive loss of the soil at a pace that to an individual farmer in an individual year is not such a big deal, but that adds up such that their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren in the traditional examples that I write about in Dirt end up paying the price. So you look at places like Syria and Libya today, we have Roman tax records that document bountiful harvests from areas today that have no soil on the surface. And it wasn't a climate shift that did that in. It was loss of the soil. And you can think of the resilience of a society to climate as being mediated by the state of their soil. If you have a thick soil that can hold water, you can better resist droughts. If you burn that soil down to a thin layer with hardly any water in it, you're at the mercy of the rain each and every year. So, climate and soil are intimately connected.
Yeah, I think the point you mentioned about Syria, for example, and the Roman Empire really drills it home for me, because it really connects this idea of the land of milk and honey to now as something that's this desert landscape almost. And I think that is a point as well that I really want to stress, because it shows people today, listeners today, that it's still very much relevant, right? This is not some ancient civilization that farmed in a destructive manner and it just influenced their civilizations. No, this has had a lasting impact. And I think I do definitely want to come back to soil conservation and look at some civilizations as well that have done things better. But before we do that, I'd like to just come back to the role that soil erosion played in colonialism and European colonialism and seeking empire. Because when we talk, I think often about colonialism and the New World, we're talking about this desire for empire, for spreading religious values, for greed. But I think we often forget the story that real hunger played in driving Europeans, because of soil erosion, to different landscapes to basically grow crops that could then be exported back home. Could you comment on that a little?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the earliest sort of example I could point to on that is really the Roman Empire, where you look at the history of farming in ancient Italy and ancient Rome, and you can trace the evolution of farms from sort of small scale family farms practicing a polyculture that were probably not very erosive on the land. And there's a major transition in Roman agriculture round about the 2nd century BC, if I recall. It's one of the reasons you write a book is so you don't have to remember things like dates. You like put them somewhere you can go look them up. But I think it was about in the transition between the 2nd century BC and the 2nd century AD. There's a huge transformation in Roman agriculture that can be traced, really, I think, to what happened when Rome sacked Carthage. It was one of the early geopolitical rivalries around the Mediterranean. And, the Roman politician Cato famously, held up, I think it was a cluster of dates on the Senate floor and said that, Carthage will bury us if we don't bury them. Look at what they can produce. And so North Africa was an agricultural powerhouse and competitor of ancient Rome. And there's a whole series of the Punic Wars where Carthage and Rome went at each other. And eventually Rome sacked Carthage, salted the earth, as we sort of all taught in high school about that conflict. But what we're not taught is that they then brought several 100,000 slaves back to Rome. So it was an early kind of colonialism and slavery connection. They brought those slaves back to Rome, and something happened in Roman agriculture that was really transformed by the immediate availability of a vast supply of really cheap labor. Farms got big, and they got specialized. They became large-scale industrial monocultures. Sound familiar? It's kind of the 20th century story of North American agriculture,
Right.
With different types of actors, obviously. And so what that did is that actually encouraged erosion of the soils off of central Italy, because you had large-scale monocultures that were intensively tilled. The Romans loved to plow, even on steep slopes. And we talked about the port being abandoned inland and the development of the Pontine marshes. But what that also did is, once the soils of central Italy were degraded, the populace in Rome still needed to be fed. And it was a large, I think the world's first, million person plus city, if I'm remembering my history right. There were a lot of people there that needed, it's where the whole bread and circus quip comes from. So keeping the populace in Rome fed, once the local terrain was no longer capable of feeding that populace, they came to rely on imports from North Africa, imports from Egypt, imports from Syria, to feed the citizens of the Roman Republic in the capital and maintain political stability. And there's great examples of food riots in ancient Rome of what happened to political stability when you can't feed the local populace. Food riots, and we had food riots in the last decade in that region, is in the Mediterranean and in Africa, places where when food becomes scarce, people will do anything to get it. Fairly simple. But that connection, it was a capital offense to interrupt the flow of grain from the colonies to Rome in those days. Why? Because political stability depended on it. So it also was a source of great wealth for the empire. So that you can trace the sort of roots of that colonialism, agriculture, and even slavery connections through Rome. The other more recent one that I write about in the book is what happened in the southern United States and the North American colonies of Europe. And there's interesting connections there between the state of the land and the rise of plantation-based agriculture, which was only economically viable if it was driven by slave labor. And this is an aspect of that history I hadn't planned on getting into, but the more that I read, the more it became clear that there were relations there. And so what was the deal? Well, if you look at what the crops were that actually allowed a positive economic return in early colonial days in North America, it turned out that tobacco was the key thing that was keeping the early British colonies at least afloat along the eastern seaboard of North America. And that worked in part because the Spanish were growing tobacco in the Caribbean, and the English public was getting hooked on tobacco. And when English settlers realized that they could actually grow particular kinds of tobacco in Virginia, they could ship it back to London. The king could put a tax on it. The British public or the English public would buy it, and they started actually supporting a great part of the British Empire through the tobacco taxes. So there's a strong economic incentive there. But the problem was the way they grew tobacco was very erosive. What they would do is they'd clear a patch of forest, and there was only about 6 to 12 inches of rich black earth that you could get a great crop of tobacco for 3 to 5 years out of a piece of land, and then it would be exhausted. They would have eroded it off, because I don't know if you've ever been in the southeast during a big rainstorm, but they can get some intense bursts of rain. You clear the forest, you leave the soil exposed, you get one of those gully washers, and you get more gullies. So you could get about 3 to 5 years of productive use out of a piece of land that you cleared. So that led to the rise of big plantations, because if you were going to stay in business, say for 50 years as a farmer, you needed 50 times the land you could degrade in any 1 year. So the idea of cultivating a small part of a plantation and moving it around over time really took root. And the way that was economically viable was with slave labor. And so they had a supply. In North America, you had a supply of, land was very cheap. Labor was expensive. it required more people to work a big piece of land and keep moving it around than just an individual farmer could do. And it led to the rise of large-scale plantations, in part because of the erosive nature of colonial agriculture. And that in turn led to the reasons, and there's a whole chapter in the book where I sort of elaborate on this in more detail and with historical footnotes, all that kind of stuff. But it basically helped set the stage for the American Civil War, because the big contention in the Civil War, that was the political contention that helped drive the U.S. apart on the issue of slavery, was what was going to be the future of slavery in new states further to the west. And why was that important? Well, because farming was moving from the eastern seaboard to the west because they degraded the land of the eastern seaboard, and the farms that remained on the eastern seaboard, sort of Virginia down to Georgia, by the Civil War, they were mostly making their living not by farming, but by selling slaves to the new farms to the west, where the agriculture was more productive in the unfortunate system that they had evolved at that time and in that place. And it became an issue of central concern to the landowners who had the wealth in the American South, that their wealth was tied up in the slave trade, and that became then a huge political issue. And we don't tend to teach that aspect, that the land degradation was one of the pillars that essentially set up the whole problem of slavery in North America. And it's obviously more complicated than just that simple issue. But there's ties to the state of the land, and people like George Washington were writing about it in the late 1700s. He was predicting that the future of the United States lay in farmers moving into the American Midwest, moving to the west side of the Appalachians, because we'd already so degraded the land of the eastern seaboard that he couldn't see how farming could be sustained there. And he was a very insightful guy.
Yeah, and I think that leads us to where we are today as well, which is that, at least back then, before the Civil War, there was room to expand west, right? So there was all this land that was, hadn't been plowed, that hadn't been used up. And now we find ourselves in a situation, and I think this is what makes the issue of soil erosion so critical, is that we've obviously reached planetary boundaries. We're using all of the arable land that's available on a global scale, and we're suddenly realizing that if we don't start changing the way that we plow our soils or the way that we treat our soils, we're running out of soil at an alarming rate. And the industrial logic that we're using right now, very much conventional industrial farming, actually encourages us to use up that soil quickly, because farmers need to pay back rent and debt for the machinery that they bought and for the pesticides and fertilizers that they're using. And so I guess that's, for me, where we find ourselves today, and how ancient civilizations, had room to expand, but we clearly don't.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the story of ancient societies is intrinsically interesting to us as people, but the real value for the future are the lessons that we can take forward with us. And, the key lesson is that, we need to take care of the land so that it can take care of us. And that if we do, it will, and if we don't, it won't. If you look at the pace of soil degradation today, there's a report, I think it came out in 2015 from the UN on a global state of the soil report. And it reported that we're losing on the order of 0.3% a third of a percent of our agricultural production capacity every year due to soil loss and degradation, those two styles of soil depletion. And that's kind of a small number. I mean, it's like 0.3%, kind of sounds like round off error, until you think about, oh, wait, it's cumulative. And if you play it out for 100 years, that adds up to a third of our food. We simply can't afford to continue at that pace of degradation, because, as you said, we don't have new places to go to. We don't have new land. The idea that we're going to go to the moon or Mars and farm it to feed Earth is kind of laughable. But we can't, as Will Rogers, I think it was, it said, it's like they're not making any more land. So we really have to learn how to farm in ways that can sustain, if not rebuild, the fertility of the soil. And there's good examples we can point to through history. There's just not many of them. We need to essentially learn the lessons of places like Incan agriculture down in South America, where they were farming terraces where they took like steep slopes and turned them into a series of flat steps and risers, and then brought all their urban organic waste back to those fields to replenish the organic matter. And some of those terraces have been farmed for 1,500 years because they closed the cycle, they closed the loop, they preserved the soil, and they brought nutrients back to the soil so they could be recycled and reused. There's an island in the Pacific called Tikopia that I write about in Dirt that turned their island into a sort of a perennial polyculture farm, sort of a food forest, if you will. They farmed every inch of it, in the ground, the medium size, and the trees. Everything was growing food. But they also had a social adaptation where every few generations they'd send a bunch of young people off in a canoe to go find their own island. So there's
Pros
a downside. Yeah, it's But the challenge is thinking about how could we actually maintain large scale food production in ways that rebuild the fertility of the land and don't degrade it. And that's what the Growing a Revolution book is about. And there's that recipe of ditching the plow, covering up, and growing diversity is the foundation for it. You can also add animals back into the mix because the manure produced by livestock is actually really valuable. It's fertilizer. It's organic fertilizer. So how we could reintegrate animal husbandry and farming is a challenge, but one worth undertaking because they only recently got divorced in the mid 20th century when we decided to try and encourage through agricultural incentives to have people specialize in either growing crops or growing livestock. And that led to CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, that turn manure, which could be a valuable resource, into a hazardous waste product by concentrating it in giant lagoons, and that grow meat that does not have the nutritional value of grass-fed meat. There's ways to sort of think about how we could reintegrate aspects of farming that have been disintegrated in the 20th century and reintegrate them into a new style of agriculture that was more regenerative, that could rebuild the fertility of the land. And that's what Growing a Revolution really is all about, is what are those principles? Does it work? Can we do it? Is it feasible? And I've gone from being something of a pessimist when I was writing Dirt, looking back at those the examples of society after society that really pulled the rug out from under their descendants by degrading their land, to now realizing that there's farmers around the world who are embracing these principles of regenerative agriculture and are leading the way to show how it's not a choice between eating and preserving the environment. We can actually, or preserving the economic viability of farms. There's one of the things I was most impressed by was how farmers that have gone this regenerative route have so improved their soil that they need to spend less on diesel because they're not plowing. So they save 50% of their diesel right there. By increasing their soil organic matter, they don't need to buy as much fertilizer. They save money there. By rebuilding the health of their soil life in ways that Ann and I talk about and grow in the Hidden Half of Nature, how that bolsters plant defense and plant health, they then need to buy less pesticide. You take, what are the big expenses on a modern farm? Well, diesel, fertilizer, and pesticide. Oh, and seeds, and that's a whole other issue that you could probably do many podcasts on. But if you can basically show that a style of farming works for maintaining crop yields, but decreases the cost of all the inputs used to generate those yields, that's a recipe for a profitable farm because you can make as much by spend a lot less getting there. And when I realized that was sort of the story of regenerative agriculture, that there were ways to do this, there were examples we could point to and crunch the numbers and go, damn, this works economically, and without much of a yield penalty, and even then only for a few years, like literally 2 or 3 kind of years in the cases that I looked at, before the soil is restored enough such that your yields with lower inputs bounce back up to what their conventional neighbors are able to do. You put all that together and it's like, wow, maybe this could actually work, and we could turn around that ancient problem of soil loss and degradation and still grow enough food to feed everybody and keep farmers in business. And some of the side benefits would be that the things you would do to rebuild the fertility of the land are the same things you would do to park carbon in the soil. And there's a climate connection with regenerative agriculture in the sense that carbon that we put back in the soil and turn into soil organic matter is carbon that's not in the atmosphere. And there's a lot of arguments about how much carbon we could, in fact, put into the world's farmland soils. But even at the low end of those estimates, it's a big number. The high end of the estimates I've seen, frankly, I don't believe. I think they're like inflated. But at the low end, even if you take the most conservative low end values, it adds up to somewhere between 5 and 15% of current fossil fuel emissions. What other thing can you point to that would clean up rivers from nitrate pollution, would actually save on diesel and fertilizer production, which is not included in that 5 to 15% number? So you'd save more, you'd keep more carbon out of the atmosphere from reducing the use of those things, so you can maybe double those numbers. And that would increase the levels of biodiversity on the world's farms, which through protecting and encouraging the beneficial insects, the predators that eat the pests, let us use less insecticide, which would mean that farmers were exposed to less toxic material to grow the food that we eat. There's all these benefits that would come along with it, from human health to planetary health in terms of climate, and simply being able to sustain agriculture. So from my perspective, I don't understand why we're not doing everything we can in the policy world to support people who are adopting regenerative agricultural methods and who are essentially weaning themselves off of the modern industrial agrochemical model of farming. And many of the farmers I visited in Growing Revolution were not organic farmers. I visited the Rodale Institute, a major organic research institute, and they're regenerative. They're doing fabulous stuff. But I also visited a lot of once conventional farmers who I now sort of teased that they were organic-ish farmers because they weren't really using much in the way of inputs anymore, of chemicals anymore. But they were self-consciously not organic farmers. And if you look at the problem of converting agriculture to more environmentally friendly practices over the next 50 years, say, we need to grow the number of organic farmers. But if we could convert all the conventional farmers into organic-ish farmers, it would do 90% of the job.
Yeah, I think that's an encouraging note to finish on. I think one final example that, for me at least, encourages me when I look kind of historically at the possibilities of us actually doing this, right, of actually making a transition in time is Cuba, right? So when you look at Cuba is just this fascinating example of, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they had no choice but to implement a lot of these conservation agriculture principles because they had no choice. And I guess that's kind of what we're going to be facing as a global society with climate change.
Yeah, there's some lessons we could learn from Cuba. And I was actually there last year consulting with them. But one of the things that really struck me in visiting there was how much they plowed. You fly into Havana, there's all kinds of bare earth. So even the Cubans have something to learn on this.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, room for improvement for everyone.
Oh yeah, and that's the strategy. That's the attitude we should be looking at. Where we're not trying to sort of throw out the best of modern technological agriculture. How I like to look at it is that what we need to do is take the best of modern technology. The things that allow us to do no-till farming are modern technology. But marry that, couple it with the ancient wisdom of crop rotations, of integrating animal husbandry and cropping and cover crops, and take that ancient wisdom and that modern technology and try and reintegrate them into a reformed style of modern agriculture. And I think when we think about it that way, there's actually a lot of room for creativity and flexibility. And the other thing that really gave me great optimism was just how intelligent, creative many of the farmers that I visited were. When they have the problem of thinking about, well, how am I going to, when they think about their land differently, and they think about the soil as this biological system rather than just a thing to hold up the chemistry they're pouring into it, they think about it as a living biological system and how to foster the beneficial life that then works for them as a farmer to help them grow crops. That they can be very creative in thinking about how to tailor those ideas to their particular farm. And we should be encouraging and rewarding that creativity.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's a great note to finish on, Dave. Just finally, where can people find you if they want to, keep following what you're up to, and when can we expect your next book?
Oh yeah, well I'm glad you mentioned both things. Ann and I are active on Twitter. Our handle is at dig2grow, dig the number 2 grow. And so if you want to follow us there, we welcome followers and feedback and interaction. We have a website that's www.dig2grow.com, dig the number 2 grow.com, and people can email us there. We're also dig2grow@gmail if you want to email us directly. If we don't respond within a few days, just email us again. um, and Ann and I are now working on a new book that's trying to look at coupling soil health to human health because the dirt book looked back at, as we've been discussing, the history of ancient civilizations and how that's played out through time. The Hidden Half of Nature book is really about the microbial life in the soil and the parallels between what happens around the root system of a plant and what happens in the human gut. And it's heavy on the microbiome and how that all works and why it matters what you eat and how you fertilize your plants. Growing Our Evolution was the book that's more that optimistic part that we ended on. Of how to actually apply those ideas to farming and all the benefits that could flow to both an individual farmer and to society at large from adopting regenerative agricultural principles and practices. But what none of that touches on directly is what does it mean to you as a consumer who eats food? And we're looking at whether or not regenerative farming practices affect the nutrient density and quality of the food that we eat and how much that affects human health. And we know that, like differences in diets matter, that, eating a carrot, even a conventional carrot, is probably better than eating a bag of sugar, even if it's organic sugar. I mean, it matters sort of what you eat. But the question, and we wrote about that in the Hidden Half, and there's not a lot of controversy among dietitians and nutritionists about that issue. It's, eating more fresh plant-based foods and less sugar-rich processed foods, that's good for you. But the question we're trying to wrestle with in this new book, which I think will be called What Your Food Ate, is
that's nice.
How does it matter what your food ate? I mean, does it matter whether you eat organic or conventional food? Is organic-ish better than conventional? Does it matter if animals if cows were eating corn, or if they're raised on eating grass? How much does that matter to the minerals and the vitamins and the phytochemicals, the things in food that actually we can connect to human health? How much does that really matter in terms of how we grow our food? And we're wrestling with that right now. We're into it. Hopefully, we'll be done in about a year or so. Sort of what it takes to put it all together.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I really look forward to that. Thanks so much, Dave.
No worries. Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk.
You can find links to all of Dave's work in the show notes below. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, do check out the episode that Dave and I did last year, which is called The Soilution. It's episode 24. And that's really where we go into detail about what conservation agriculture is and how, with the right techniques, so with cover crops, rotating crops, and ditching the plow, how we can move towards a regenerative agricultural system. That is it for now, guys. As always, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by subscribing via iTunes, by rating and reviewing the show via iTunes. You can find, stream, and listen to the podcast on all of your favorite podcast apps, or you can go directly to our website, that's www.forfoodsake.me, and stream them directly from there. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The social media handle for all those platforms is For Food's Sake Me. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next time.